Good morning, distinguished guests and colleagues. My name is Amikam Elad, and as the head of the Institute of Asian and African Studies, I'm happy and honored to open the second annual international conference, The Middle East in Transition, at the Hebrew University, organized by the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies of the Institute of Asian and African Studies and the Truman Institute under auspices of the Ruth and Mordechai Abir Foundation. We want to extend our thanks to the academic committee of this conference, to Nama Shefter, Seri Kashriel, Zhenya Yudkevich, and especially to Dr. Nimrod Cohen for their untiring efforts and dedication in its preparation of this conference. Ahead of us are 2 full days of lectures and discussions on divergent topics that are the cause of the academic discussion within the realms of the historical, social, and ideological aspects of the contemporary Middle East. Therefore, without a delay, with further ado, I would like to invite the first of this conference to greet you, Professor Reuven Amitai, the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at the Hebrew University.
Dear colleagues from Israel and abroad, honored guests, good morning. I am very happy to participate in this opening session of the second annual conference on the Middle East in Transition. There can be little doubt that the title of this conference gives expression to fluid developments in our region. Long-standing authoritarian regimes fall or totter, new intellectual and cultural currents move across the Arab world and beyond, traditional international arrangements and relations are called into question, and new social and political forces emerge. These are heady times, and it is a good thing that we are able to gather together here in Jerusalem for a couple of days to consider these matters in a deep and comparative way. We can ask ourselves, how is the best way to study the modern and contemporary Middle East, not the least as the events unfold? I think at the Hebrew University in general, perhaps in Israeli academia in general, at the Hebrew University and the Faculty of Humanities in particular, we have developed over the years, and one could say for even the decades, a multi-layered approach. On the one hand, we believe that a solid grounding in the history and culture of the region is the bedrock on which all advanced study of the region is based. To this, we add a commitment to the study of the area's languages in order to gain an unmediated and deep acquaintance with sources, be they in written or traditional or digital forms or in other media. Our specialists in the modern Middle East devote themselves to following developments, using traditional and contemporary source material, often striving to adopt and apply the insights and methodologies of the social sciences, not the least through ongoing contacts with colleagues from these disciplines. And finally, we widen our perspective by cooperative ventures with colleagues from outside the university, in and out of academia, both in Israel and abroad. All of these components are evident in the rich and wide program of this conference, and it has the making of a very interesting and enlightening gathering. I confess that I am not just an innocent observer of this particular conference. As many know, I myself am a member of the Institute of Asian and African Studies and the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies, 2 of the bodies that worked to organize the event. In fact, last year, before becoming dean, I was heavily involved in setting up the first conference bearing this name. I think that all will agree that the conference last year was successful enough, but we also noticed several shortcomings. The lessons appear to have been well learned. I congratulate the organizers for a job well done. They have managed to put their collective finger on a number of key issues and developments and put together an excellent program, assembling a wide cast of speakers from the Hebrew University, other institutions in Israel, and abroad. I first wish to express my gratitude to the members of the Institute of Asian and African Studies and the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies who were involved in planning the conference. Dr. Nimrod Cohen did a fine job as coordinator of the conference, and he was ably assisted by Mrs. Jenya Yutkovich, the dedicated administrator of the Institute of Asian and African Studies. I would also like to thank the Harry S. Truman Research Institute for the Advancement of Peace, its staff and its director, Professor Steve Kaplan, for their involvement and encouragement from the very beginning of the planning process and their work in executing the project. We are particularly grateful to the Ruth and Mordechai Abir Foundation for its support and vision that made this possible, and we send our greetings and best wishes to Professor Abir and to Ruth Abir, who are unable to be with us today. This is a conference of scholars and other students of developments of the region, but it aims to reach a wide audience, not only those who join us in the hall today and tomorrow, but also those who will follow the lectures and discussion via the internet and other media who are not physically present now. We are off to a good start. I wish you all fruitful and enjoyable discussions and welcome you to the Hebrew University.
Thank you, Professor Amitai. I would like to invite Professor Stephen Kaplan, the academic director of the Harry S. Truman Research Institute for the Advancement of Peace, to say a few words, please.
Thank you, Amikam. I feel a little bit guilty every time my colleagues have to say the entire name of the Truman Institute as they roll it up. I figure after the first few times everyone says the Truman Institute and we can figure we've got the right one, although I should point out that earlier this year we jointly sponsored an event in Haifa in which they had the logo of some other Truman Institute on the invitation. So it's good we have the whole name. I want to welcome everybody to this second annual conference funded through the Ruth and Mordechai Abir Foundation. It's a special pleasure for me from a number of points of view. I think as many of the people in the audience today, I was originally a student of Mocha Abir's, and then I was a colleague of his. So really from 1977 on, we worked together. It's often forgotten in the midst of the Middle East discussions of Mocha that his doctorate was about Ethiopia in a period called the Era of the Princes, where there was no centralized ruler in Ethiopia. In fact, when I first met him, he was working on a book called Ethiopia and the Red Sea. And so it's wonderful to have this opportunity. And as with Reuven, I think we all send our greetings to the Abir family and our gratitude for their generosity of spirit and for their support for this endeavor. It's also, I would like to thank the organizing committee. The names have been mentioned, so I won't go into all the detail, but certainly Nimrod Gorin, who pulled together the academic parts, Zhenya, Cheryl, Hillary, Naama, the academic members of the committee. I've often felt that when you get a little conference invitation like this, that if it would be possible, at least on the online version, there should be footnotes, which sort of explain, oh, you don't know how hard we had to work to get this panel set up, or no one thought this would be a good idea, and now everyone's glad we're doing it. I should say in that context that when we first sat down, and I guess we felt already then sort of pressured when we were sitting down in the fall to begin talking about what was going to be, we obviously had no idea which of these panels and how many of them were going to be of tremendous relevance today. And I just point out that we did not think that Egypt after Mubarak was going to be a historical panel, but rather one trying to look into the future. So I'd really like to thank the academic committee, and I'd like to thank all the participants in the conference. One of the things that's noticeable, if you look at the program from last year's conference, there is virtually no overlap in terms of the speakers, 2 or 3 speakers. The rest are different speakers, and I think that's a tremendous testimony to the riches that there are in contemporary Middle Eastern studies, not only at the Hebrew University, but in the other universities in the country, in other institutions at the country. And I think we all can be very proud that this area is doing well, despite what we always hear about the difficulties that academia faces. Finally, just a word. It's always a pleasure as the head of the Truman Institute when we were able to cooperate with other parts of the university or other universities in organizing programs. The way that we, the Truman Institute, but also people working in academia today are going to be able to do the sort of work that, that we want to keep doing and have the resources for it, is to cooperate with each other, to build coalitions and alliances, to think together, to get beyond ideas of zero-sum games of who gets the most credit. And I have to say this has been one of the most pleasurable cooperations we've had at the Institute. So I'd like to thank all the members of the Institute of Asian and African Studies and of the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies. Wish you all a wonderful 2 days of discussion. And finally, since no one's done it so far, I'll be the one to do it. And could you please turn off your cell phones? Thank you.
I would like to call upon Mr. Nadav Solomonovich on behalf of the Abir Scholarship recipients to say a few words.
Thank you, Amikam. Good morning. Dear guests, colleagues, and friends, I'm honored to stand here today as the representative of the Abir Scholarship recipients in order to convey our utmost gratitude to Professor Mordechai Abir and his wife Ruth. The financial troubles of an MA student are well known to all of you. The difficulties of working a full-time job, sometimes even more, and attending your family's needs take their toll and, of course, does not make the writing of an excelling research paper easy, to say the least. The lack of scholarship in the MA studies and the slim chances of getting a future academic position due to the difficult financial status of the universities are always on our minds and constitute a heavy burden on our shoulders. And indeed, because of that, most of the MA students of the department decide to complete their studies without writing a thesis and do not proceed to PhD studies. As many of you may know, a large number of courses given in the department in the past few years by young scholars or those without academic tenure are financed by the generosity of the Abir Foundation. And thus, the Foundation's contribution is twofolded. First, it diversifies the students' classes and their curriculum. And second, and more important, it gives young scholars the opportunity to make a name for themselves and win recognition that might help them to stay in the academic world. For me, that is the greatest achievement of the Foundation. It helps young students and scholars at the two instances in which they actually need it, the MA stage and after they complete their PhDs. I can only hope that with their help and support, some of us may move from the first category to the second. On a more personal note, I have to say that since I got the announcement on being one of the fortunate students to win the scholarship, my thesis has suddenly come to life. Not only because I was able to devote more time to it, but also the fact that someone found my thesis interesting enough to give me a scholarship gave me a huge push and motivation. And for this, I'm in their debt. So to conclude, on behalf of the scholarship recipients, I would just like to thank Mordechai and Ruth Abir from the bottom of our hearts for their great generosity and support in us, the students, as well as the department, and to promise that we'll do whatever we can to justify it. Thank you all, and I hope you all enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Nadav. Yes, I would like to call upon Professor Gilles Kepel and Professor Amnon Cohen, of course, the chair of the first session of today's conference. Please.
Good morning, everybody. When we were planning this conference, that was several months ago, trying to identify the main themes of our scholarly endeavor, as well as topics most relevant for a wider audience, no one among us imagined that calling the conference the Middle East in Transition, as you see, will become so topical. Looking at today's Middle East, it seems that the title of our gathering will still be valid for quite some time, maybe leading to the next conference next year, perhaps even further on. While academic organizers may elegantly dismiss this lack of foresight as a forgivable lapses, Israeli public opinion has been much more severe in its judgment when referring to this country's intelligence agencies, gathering agencies, that failed to detect, let alone warn, of the gathering political tsunami that had recently hit regimes and governments in the Middle East and North Africa. To discuss and analyze the recent developments in the Middle East, we are very privileged to have with us this morning Professor Gilles Kepel, who is Professor and Chair Middle East and Mediterranean Studies at the Institut d'études politiques Paris, Sciences Po, where he heads the program on the Arab and Muslim world. Professor Kepel is a steady contributor to many international and Arabic language newspapers and is regularly interviewed by the most influential TV channels and radio programs in Europe and the United States. His recent publications deal with the basic political problems and developments in the Middle East. You've just been distributed an op-ed piece that he published last weekend in the New York Times. But his main effort, of course, is writing books rather than writing op-ed articles. So I'll just mention three of them, the last three. That is Beyond Terror and Martyrdom, which which was published by Harvard University Press in 2008. The War for Muslim Minds, Harvard 2004, and Jihad, The Trail of Political Islam, which, like the other books, appeared earlier on in French, and in English it came out by Harvard 2002. Professor Kepel will address us on his topic, the Middle East, Change or Crisis. Professor Kepel, please.
Well, distinguished friends and colleagues, I'm extremely pleased to be here with you today, and I will have to say something quite different than what my friend Amnon Cohen just told you. When I heard him call me a few months ago in Paris, and when I identified his charmingly Villejuif accented, perfect French accent, I knew something was in the making, and I could not have foreseen this big thing taking place in the Middle East, but the fact that he said, you know, why don't you come and talk to us about Middle Eastern transition? But now, those people are, once again, they're planning ahead. I was proven right. So congratulations on your foresight. And if you look at the little op-ed piece, you're right to say that I haven't published many op-ed pieces in my life, because when I published this one, they sent me something, said, we noticed that in our files, your last contribution was 1996. So I will not be identified as someone who spends his time writing op-ed pieces. But I thought that I could write this op-ed piece for you, for your conference, as a tit for tat. And you will see that I sort of make a little fun of people who look at the Middle East and consider that analyzing the historical and sociological dimensions of phenomena in the Middle East is irrelevant, and that those who predicted the clash of civilization a couple of decades ago and considered that this was the prism to understand what was happening, have now put poor Samuel Huntington's book for an autodafé, and consider that there is nothing to see, that people in Egypt, Tunisia, and Bahrain, Yemen, and others tweet, they're on Facebook, they Google, so they're just like us. I mean, Huntington had told us that they were others. Now we know they're just like us, so move on, there's nothing to see. I will contend quite the contrary, and that
people like my colleague Amnon Cohen here, and most of you, all of you at the Truman Institute, and what we try to do in Europe goes in the same direction. I mean, trying to decipher and understand what is happening in the Middle East, in Arab countries, in Israel, in Iran, in Turkey, and so on and so forth, means that we have a sound grasp of not only of history, but also of culture, of languages, and of the social and political dimensions of the phenomena that are taking place. So, even though our disciplines or fields of expertise are regularly attacked as because they're considered as incapable of foreseeing the future, at least, so I hope, can we try to take stock of what is happening, and if not predicting the future, we may have some social use in order to understand the present. And I believe that this is the great challenge that we are now facing. What is happening in the Middle East and North Africa, or in North Africa and the Middle East, because the whole thing started in Tunisia, something we should not forget, and I will get back to that in a minute. And based on an analysis of what is happening, what kind of scenarios can we think of for the future? So that will be the core of my introduction. And I have to say that I'm not here mainly to listen to what I have to say, because I'm not interested in what I have to say. I'm more interested in what you're going to tell me. Because clearly I believe that Israel is, and the Palestinians also, are at a defining moment with this change or crisis which is happening in the Middle East. I mean, there will be a need for redefinition of political identity, political priorities, both in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, in Ramallah, and probably in Gaza as well. So I'm quite eager to have a dialogue with the distinguished members of the audience here today, and I don't have many answers, but I have a lot of questions, and I hope you will share them with you. If we try to put what happened in perspective, I believe that the first statement I would like to make is that, to an extent, we are seeing the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. This being said, what kind of era, and when did the previous era start? I believe that we are seeing, to some extent, the end of the decade that started with 9/11. And that the fact that we had those social movements in the Arab world, in the public Arab sphere, if I may say so, that were coined in the parlance of democracy, that wanted, aimed at, and at times succeeded in toppling authoritarian powers that be, such as Ben Ali's in Tunisia and Mubarak's in Egypt. That they succeeded, for some, as I said, and that they did not use the vocabulary of political Islam to do so, is something extremely important. Why is that, and how can we evaluate the whole situation? If we go back to 9/11, at the time, 9/11 was perceived as, in a sense, a confirmation of Huntington's analysis that definitely the Arab world and the Muslim world were really other. They were the enemy, the other. And even more so, that they were on a different path of contemporary history as opposed to the sort of universal contemporary history. While Latin America had gotten rid of its dictators, while Eastern Europe had gotten rid of the Soviet system, and while even a number of non-Arab Muslim countries had moved from authoritarian to pluralistic or democratic rule, from Indonesia to Turkey, Arab societies looked like they were marginalized, or that they were not into this path. That there was a sort of curse on them, and that in a way they were caught between the rock of the Arab-Israeli dispute and the hard place of the oil rent. That they had some peculiarity, some specificity in terms of their relation to the world system. The Arab-Israeli conflict, in a way, was an opportunity for authoritarian rules to contend that there should be no pluralism, because it would be used by the Zionist enemy to divide up the ranks of Arab societies. And the oil rent, which is not distributed evenly in all Arab countries, but which is prevalent in many of them, and which has effects even in the countries which do not benefit from it directly, was a sure recipe, and still is a sure recipe, for the non-existence of a pluralistic or democratic institutional pact, if I may say so. When you have access to oil and gas rent, you do not need to negotiate with your entrepreneurial middle classes. On the contrary, rather, you would not like them to emerge, because you redistribute part of the rent to your society to keep it quiet, but you do not allow for political participation and also for the possibility for this society to topple you or to change you. And this, I believe, was part and parcel of the major problem. Within this framework, Islamist political movements were perceived from the mid-1970s onwards by a number of people in Arab societies, but also in Muslim societies at large, as the way out of this dilemma or of this vicious circle. And they were backed by a significant number of followers, and the 1990s was a decade where we saw the surge of those movements. They were of different types. Some, as was the case with Hezbollah in Lebanon or with Hamas in the Palestinian territories, were eager to have an important grassroots outreach, while being adamant on their military dimension, if you wish. And they managed to combine the two in a way that allowed both of them to control significant elements of their communities, and ultimately, as would prove to be the case for Hamas, to control part of Palestine, the Gaza Strip, and for Hezbollah to control largely the Shiite community in Lebanon, and nowadays to exert a significant amount of control over Lebanon as a whole. To some extent, Hamas and Hezbollah, seen from the prism of Islamist political movements, were, if I may say so, the success stories of political Islam in the 90s and the early 2000s. But on the other hand, and in most Sunni countries, Arab countries, Islamist movements proved deeply divided into two main tendencies that would not manage to reconcile, something that would lead to the fragmentation of the movement, to the loss of its unity, of its integrity, and of its appeal, and of its capacity to seize power. On the one hand, you had the more radical groups that aimed to use exemplary and minority violence in order to demonstrate that the powers that be, the lackeys of the West, of imperialism, Zionism, and what have you, to quote unquote, were weak, that they were colossi with clay feet, and that they could be undermined. Demonstrating their weakness was a means to attempt to mobilize the masses on the slogans and on the worldviews of those movements, in the hope that those masses would rise and topple the powers that be and bring about an Islamic state implementing Sharia on the ruins of the failed pro-Western autocratic state. Those movements took the lead in Algeria during the civil war in the 90s. They were extremely strong in Egypt in the same period, and they also spread to Bosnia during the war in former Yugoslavia. They spread to Chechnya. They spread to Pakistan and Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, there was another trend that was running within those movements of political Islam, which was exemplified quite early on by the Turkish Islamic movement, which considered that participation into the institutionalized political system was a means, as opposed, a chief means, as opposed to violence at first, and little by little would become an end. And to some extent, if we want to compare radical Islamic movements to, say, the Haute Armée fraction in Germany, or the Brigate Rosse in Italy, or Action Directe in France, who sort of were interested in exemplary violence to wake up the working class of Europe that was interested in paying the installments for their cars or their refrigerators and so on and so forth, instead of mobilizing for class struggle. Then we could compare what would become the AKP in Turkey and some others or the PJD in Morocco and some others, to the communist parties of Western Europe who participated in the political system, thinking that they would enter into it, destroy it from the inside, and finally lead to the establishment of socialism by legal means. But, as history showed, they were sort of poisoned by their participation, and the means finally took over the aims, and they became social democrats. This, of course, has to do with other major social and economic changes, the fact that the industrial age passed away, that the great unionized, communist-led systems of solidarity in Western Europe were not relevant anymore to face the challenges of post-industrial society, and so on and so forth. But, as we shall see, there is a lot of change also happening in the Middle East, socially and economically. And the old parlance of the Muslim Brothers is now challenged by the emerging young generation to be able to deal with this challenge. Now, in the 1990s, I believe that in most Sunni Arab countries, the Islamist movement was sort of divided between those two major tendencies. The one which was radical, military, terrorist, if you want, and the other one that was more into participation, political participation. By the end of the 1990s, the radicals had lost in Egypt, they had lost in Algeria, they had lost in Bosnia, they had lost in Chechnya, and so on and so forth. And the movement was deeply divided. This is why at the time in a book that Amnon mentioned earlier on, which was published in 2000, which was called Jihad, and which in French was subtitled Expansion et déclin de l'islamisme, Expansion and Decline of Islamism, I had argued that Islamism as such would be challenged as a major vehicle for opposition and for change in Islamic society, in Muslim societies, not because it was irrelevant as such, but because it could not bring together its different constituencies. Now, 9/11 happened, and as of 12/11, a number of people in the French press asked that I be sacked from the university because what I had to say was laughable. And Huntington had his second coming, if I may say so, his second apotheosis, because there it was clear that you had to do with a clash of civilizations. Whatever was being said about Arabs and Muslims or what have you, they were on the side of the other. They were into violence, into terrorism, and so on and so forth. But my contention was that the bin Ladens and the Al-Qaeda people were actually compelled to use this mode of action, i.e. 9/11 and bringing havoc to America, because they had failed on the ground in the 1990s. And even though they captured the world's attention, even though they seemed to be, or they became central on everybody's agenda, nevertheless, what was at the core of their action, what they desperately had strived to do in the 1990s, had failed to do, and were trying again to manage, i.e. mobilizing the masses for radical change and for revolution, had failed. And it would fail again in the first decade of the 2000s. the fact that Al-Qaeda, bin Laden, and the others were so high on the agenda over the decade that we just lived allowed, to an extent, the autocratic regimes of the region, the Ben Alis and the Mubaraks, to have a sort of life extension, because they were perceived, or they said they were, the bulwark against terrorism. And we in the West would turn a benign eye or a benevolent eye towards their behavior, because the most important issue was that, you know, they were protecting us, and that they were the most, they were the first line in the battle against terrorism. Now that after a decade of efforts, Al-Qaeda and its followers have proved to be a cult without the capacity to mobilize the masses. We probably still have the capacity to plant bombs and to use terror. But, you know, terrorism also has a political economy of its own. One may think that on the short term, you know, when you compare the costs and the benefits of a terrorist action, some people say that 9/11 costed $50,000 or $500,000? I don't remember, but anyway, whatever. If you compare the magnitude of the consequences and the small investments, it's just great. You know, the economy of terrorism is there's a return on investment which is unbelievable. That's on the short term. But on the long term, it doesn't work. If you do not manage to start up mobilization, right? And it did not work over the last decade. There was no mobilization. And the more you repeat acts of terrorism, I mean, in the beginning, it looks like you're mighty, that you can do everything you want. You go to Spain, you go to London, you go wherever. Then, if you don't manage to shift gears, then it's a political failure. And this is where we arrived. In this general context, I believe, we have to put this big change, which we may call the Arab Democratic Revolution. Let's go back to how events unfolded in Tunisia first, and then in Egypt. Amnon mentioned the fact that Israeli intelligence was ridiculed and pointed at because it was unable to predict what happened. What should I say about France, which witnessed the first slogan of this Arab Democratic Revolution, which was expressed in French, Ben Ali, dégage, get out, which was subsequently translated into Arabic as Arhal. And it's a euphemism to say that my government was not really able to understand what was happening. And will not be cruel on that, because one of the consequences of the Arab Revolution was that we had to have a reshuffling in the French government, which is, you know, beyond the travels of our former foreign minister to Tunisia for Christmas. This is more significant. There has a more in-depth consequence that has to, I think it underlines the fact that what happens in the southern and eastern, but as far as we're concerned, the southern mainly shore of the Mediterranean is also of deep significance for our domestic policies. And you may have witnessed the debate on whether or not the revolutions or the fact that there is no peace and order anymore in Tunisia or Libya or Egypt will lead to massive waves of immigration to Europe. I mean, this may be a fear which is exaggerated. And I was in the plane yesterday with the mayor of Marseille, Jean-Claude Gaudin, who discussed that, and he said that in his constituency in Marseille, people were panic-stricken, on his electors, at this idea that there would be an Arab tide of immigrants that would make of Marseille finally an Arab city 100%. It's only 20% for the time being. And what happens in Tunisia originally was at first a social movement. Mohamed Bouazizi, who set himself ablaze and who was what is called in Arabic a ba'i mutajawwil, a street vendor, had his car and his merchandise seized by a local female policeman, was humiliated, set himself ablaze in Sidi Bouzid in central Tunisia, is a rather deprived area. And when you think of it in perspective, when you think of people committing suicide or martyrdom over the last decade, you know it better than many others, suicide attacks or martyrdom operations, amaliyat intihariya or istishhadiya, the way you want to look at them, were aimed at killing the enemy directly, killing as many Israelis as possible, and so on and so forth. When Mohamed Bouazizi committed suicide, he was not trying to kill anyone. He just wanted to catch attention on the plight of himself and the others like him, who were despised by the political system, who felt what is called in North African colloquial hogra, contempt, mépris, and who felt that they had no jobs, and that the regime had become not only an authoritarian regime, but also a regime that would not deliver and that would live in extortion, and so on and so forth. So the first step was the social movement. It could have remained a social movement of the young urban poor, if you wish, of which Mohamed Bouazizi was a symbol. But what made this social movement become a revolution was the coalescence of different social classes, as is the case in all revolutions. And the movement became a revolution when it was joined by the urban middle classes of Tunis, the entrepreneurial middle classes, who had been boosted early on by the Ben Ali regime when he toppled Bourguiba on his famous medical coup d'etat, as it was called at the time. While after decades Ben Ali had been perceived mainly as a man who ruled by extortion, all the more so as he had married the hairdresser, as the Tunis bourgeoisie called Leila Trabelsi, which added, if you wish, insult to injury. You know, to have an extorter was one thing, but to have a hairdresser as someone who practices extortion on the Tunisian bourgeoisie, which thinks of itself very, very highly, both very well educated in Islam and perfectly at ease with most refined French manners. I mean, what has this hairdresser to do with that? And so the alliance or the coalescence, the coalition between the young urban poor and the middle class in Tunis created the necessary strength to oust the Ben Ali regime, together with the help of the Tunisian army. And as you know, Tunisia was a police state more than an army state. And whenever I went to Tunisia over the last 10 years, I was always invited by the army, actually, never by the police. And they had their own think tanks and things like that. And it was clear when you had a chat with them afterwards. It was the only place where you could talk in Tunisia, and that they were not favorable to the regime. And also, a number of the officers felt just like their brothers among the educated, largely secular middle classes of Tunis. They were fed up with Ben Ali, and they would take the risk of joining forces with the poor. So Ben Ali went. And we have now this revolutionary situation in Tunisia, where the lead was taken, where the fuel, if you wish, was provided by the young urban poor, but where the lead was taken presently by the middle classes, the largely secularized middle classes, with the Tunisian Islamists coming back, of course, from their exile in Rashid Ghannouchi, the other Ghannouchi, and now the only Ghannouchi, because Mohammed Ghannouchi has been ousted at his turn. Rashid Ghannouchi coming back from London. But if you look at the parlance of the revolution, at the mobilization, this revolution was not at all coined in Ghannouchi's and Nahda's parlance. Not at all. That does not mean that there are no Islamists anymore in Tunisia. And what I mentioned earlier on, when I sort of went back into recent history of Islamist movements, is that I believe that within the Tunisian, and we'll see in a minute, within the Egyptian Islamist movement also, you have this attempt to function in a sort of AKP model, if you wish. And one thing which is interesting is that Tunisia, like Turkey, is blessed for not having oil. Therefore, you have a system where entrepreneurs and their workers, of course, create national wealth. Hence, they are eager to have their say in the political process. Now the challenge for the present leaders of the Tunisian revolution is to what extent they will or will not be able to deliver, socially and economically. If they cannot provide jobs, if they cannot provide a feeling of equality, and also they cannot start again Tunisian economy, which is based to a large extent on its relations with Europe. I mean, I'm sure that clothes I wear, to some parts of them were sewn in Tunisia. And many people go there on holidays and so on and so forth. So there is a sort of complementarity between the economy of the EU and of North Africa, particularly Tunisia and Morocco. If it's not put back on tracks, then they are going to be in trouble. And this is where you may have an Islamist movement that will push its old slogans on the fore and create a challenge or a dangerous challenge. This is to say that, I haven't quite used the word Twitter or Google or Facebook or whatever yet. Not that I consider that the social networks and the like are irrelevant. I mean, they were very important because they were the condition for those young people who took to the streets to be connected. And they were the ones on whose networks the distance or the frustration, the relative frustration, which as we know is the essence of all revolutions, could be expressed and displayed at its best, because everyone could measure the discrepancy between the state of public liberties, between the economy and so on and so forth, in the Middle East and in the developed world. But those social networks that helped mobilize, because they brought together people who did not significantly belong to political parties, hence who were not under the radar of intelligence systems in such states as Tunisia and Egypt, which were based on mukhabarat, on intelligence. This revolution, in a way, was a means to turn around the intelligence control in those societies. This was the good point, right? But the dark side of that is that those movements have difficulties in making politics because they have no experience in party politics. Some people have compared what happened in the Arab world with the 1989 movements in Eastern Europe. And I had a debate with some Polish colleagues about that recently, and the difference was that in Eastern Europe, in former Soviet Europe, you had political mobilization prior to the tumbling of the regimes. You had Solidarność, you had Charter 77, you had the Samizdat, you had networks that were organized, that were repressed, that you had people who were ready to get into politics. This is not exactly the case in the Arab world today. And this is why after phase one, both in Egypt and Tunisia and Egypt, after they were toppled, the previous rulers were toppled, now there is a sort of political vacuum and a big question mark about the future. Let me just say one word about Egypt, and then I'll stop, and we can have an exchange, hopefully. In Egypt, as opposed to Tunisia, there was no Mohammed Bouazizi as such. I mean, some people set themselves ablaze also, but it did not have the same dimension, if you wish. And what was very striking was the Tahrir Square phenomenon. There was no such thing as a Tahrir Square phenomenon in Tunisia, if you wish. And the fact that the whole of politics was on stage. Tahrir Square was a big stage where TV cameras were present, filming everything, and they were there and Googling and with their iPhones and iPads and what have you. Something which was very important because they seized political parlance, they seized the nexus of communication, and it proved impossible for the Egyptian Mukhabarat regime that had been unable to cope with that to survive after a while. And I will not get back into the details of what happened in Egypt because I think you know that perfectly well. Where are we now? In Egypt, where you had historians interested in contemporary issues consider that you had those two possibilities for succession to the throne in Egypt. Either a pharaonic system where your son would be your successor, and this was the leaning of the Mubarak of the old days, of the latter day Mubarak, if I may say so, together with the model that had taken shape in Syria or that is trying to take shape in Libya. But the other, the real core system, which the Mubaraks had twisted and which was, in a way, a reason for the dissatisfaction of the military top brass with him, was that, once the Mamluk, the chief of the Mamluks died, all the other Mamluks would seize his children and strangle them, so that another Mamluk would be elected from among the top brass to make sure that what is called military incorporated still controls and rules the country. And it's not by coincidence that the first victim was Gamal, Ahmed Aiz, and all the people who were interested in the pharaonic succession and not in the Mamluk succession. Then, the military, I would not say seized power because they already had power, but they stopped pretending that they had a civilian face. It's the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which is the body governing Egypt today, with the Field Marshal Tantawi and General Annan. So has the Egyptian revolution led to a sort of revamping of the military? And will everything remain as it was? Not quite. Not quite, because I believe that the military have understood that they just cannot rule the country as they did, because the country will explode. It is dysfunctional. An interesting phenomenon happened last week when, 2 days of distance, Mohammed Ghannouchi stepped down, and then Ahmed Shafiq stepped down in Egypt. The prime ministers that were the remnants of the Ancien Régime, in a way, were forced out. And the interesting thing was that Ahmed Shafiq actually had to resign after a 3-hour or 4-hour debate on a private Egyptian TV station with Egyptian writer Ala al-Aswani, who excruciated him. And that the military were compelled to choose a new prime minister who had been a younger, junior cabinet minister under Mubarak earlier on, but who had taken place in demonstrations in Tahrir Square. And last night someone, an Israeli journalist who had covered the Egyptian movement, showed me the first page of Le Progrès Égyptien, which is an old Egyptian daily in French, which was, always under Mubarak, Sadat, and whatever, saying that the regime did so and so, and that praised whatever the regime did. And then you had the new prime minister in the middle of Tahrir Square, and the title was extolling the Ancien Regime and things like that. Big change. Now, where is this going to go? For the time being, everything is open. And this is why there is a lot of hope, but at the same time, there is much fear, if I understand well, particularly in this country, about the future of Arab revolutions. One thing is, I believe this is the most important issue, the social dimension. Under the language of democracy that was the key to mobilization lies access to jobs, lies social and economic participation. In Egypt, the discrepancy is huge between a rather small group of people who are fully globalized and who benefited a lot from the economic opening, and the huge cohorts of the young people who survive with difficulties. And if you remember, there was an episode during Tahrir Square, which was the attack of Tahrir Square by the camel and horse owners of the pyramids. I mean, people who take the tourists on horseback and camelback on the pyramids, and every other day on Tahrir Square meant that they just couldn't survive. They had no tourists. So you had this strange thing, this clash of centuries, where you had it was not the charge of the Light Brigade, but the charge of the camel owners of the pyramids with sticks, attacking the kids in Tahrir Square with their iPhones and iPads and what have you, and laptops. And but those people were starving. And starving, they thought, because of the demonstration. Well, the Mubarak thugs were around, and what is called in Egypt the Beltageya, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, as opposed to Tunisia, where you had a social movement, the Bouazizi symbolized social movement that started the whole thing. In Egypt, the hoi polloi did not mobilize spontaneously originally. They would actually join the movement the day after Mubarak said he was there to stay. And as you know, the day after he was ousted. And one last thing is the role of the Muslim Brothers. And everybody, many people, particularly here, are panic-stricken at the idea that the Muslim Brothers are actually waiting for their day to come and that they will reap the fruits of all that chaos, as was the case in Iran in 1978-79. Secularized liberal middle classes started the Iranian Revolution in the Goethe Institute poetry evenings in Tehran, and at the end of the day, Ayatollah Khomeini and his ilk seized the whole thing. There is a big difference. One, that Khomeini had managed to control the vocabulary of the revolution, what he called, and pardon my poor Farsi, Wahdet Kalimeh, which is Wahdat al-Kalima, the unicity of the discourse. He controlled the discourse. Something which the brothers and the Islamists have absolutely not managed to do. I mean, when you read their publications, you read the Ikhwan Web or their publications in Arabic or whatever, listen to them. They haven't managed. Even when Yusuf al-Qaradawi came to Tahrir Square a couple of weeks ago to lead Friday prayer, I listened to him very closely, very carefully. the important thing that you had Qardawi on Tahrir Square, so it was there, they were coming back. He was there, he was listened to, but even though he managed to have his usual thing, saying that he wanted to pray on Al-Aqsa, nevertheless, he was unable to push most of his own agenda. He was compelled to speak Tahrir Square language to a large extent. Otherwise, he would have been perceived irrelevant. Now, this is politics, right? And but as of now, I believe they're still unable to control the agenda. Also, they are deeply divided into ideological, for the reasons I mentioned before, and also generational lines. A number of the young brothers who were on Tahrir Square with the demonstrators considered that the old turbans are part and parcel of the Ancien Régime, that actually they were the co-organizers of the old system. And as you know, I mean, this is something for, looking at Shimon Shamir here, who knows the Egyptian system better than I do, thinking that the buildings of Amn al-Dawla, of state security, were stormed by the crowd, that now their archives are being, the ones that had not been burned, are being published. And you saw this episode where you had the chief of intelligence dealing, I don't remember his name, dealing with the brothers and negotiating, okay, we're going to give you that percentage in this constituency, you'll have this candidate, no, I want this one. Where, they look like they were part and parcel of the system, is really, I believe, is quite detrimental to them for the time being. But there again, the issue will be mainly social and economic. And to what extent will the new groups be able to deliver? After all, what made the success of the AKP possible in Turkey was the fact that the pluralistic and democratic opening of Turkey was coincidental with a tremendous economic development, and that people would identify with a political party which they thought brought them new job opportunities, raised their expectancies, their wages, and so on and so forth. And this is the big challenge. So as far as Europeans, as members of the EU, I think that what we have to do is to try to help as much as we can for the social and economic success in those revolutions, particularly in a country like Tunisia, where it's easier to act right now. And I will not take any more of your time and not get into Libya, but we can discuss that in the Q&A session. Libya, of course, is a problem for itself, and we shall discuss it. It's also a problem for Egypt and Tunisia, because the more Tunisians and Egyptians who used to make money in Libya are repatriated, the more they join with the unemployed, with the poor, who will put more and more pressure on the present leaders of the half-achieved revolutions of Tunisia and Egypt, and the more scary the future of that will be. I will stop here. I'm sorry I was too long, but we'll put it under a zuruf because of the circumstances. And I'd be more than pleased to have your feedback, and because as we discussed that with Amnon earlier on, and in a way we're at one of those rare moments where we are looking at history in the making. So no one can predict anything, I believe, but what I think our role as academics and as people who are specialized in this issue can be defined. It's to try to take stock and make an assessment of how we see things unfold from a social, a political, and also religious and cultural dimension. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll, in the best tradition of the Middle East, I'll take the prerogative of being the chair, and will take, of course, questions, as our speaker was kind enough to accept questions and answer, discussion. And I will cut short the break, the coffee break, whoever feels that he has this excruciating needs to get coffee, well, may do that, but we'll stay on here, and we are ready to take questions, which I believe our speaker will collect and then decide in the best tradition of the goal which ones he's going to take and which ones he's not going to answer. Okay. Yes, please. Okay, please raise your hands if you have any comments or questions, and we'll take them down as they come, one at a time. Yes, Art, but please be brief in your questions so that we be more elaborate in our answers.
D'abord, comme un ancien de Sciences Po, bienvenue à Jérusalem.
Merci.
But I'll pass into English, my mother tongue. I think the issue very much hinges, as you said, on means and ends with regard to the Ikhwan. And I think, in a sense, the issue of clash of civilizations may be missing a critical point, that the Ikhwan, the political branch, is still determined to achieve domination, and that they are in the best tradition of Western revolutions, whether it be the French with the Terror, whether it be the Russian with the Bolsheviks, etc. And that once tasting party, tasting power, even if only in a coalition framework, their appetite will be whetted for an ultimate end, which is Islamic domination. And with regard, I'd love your comment on this. Just one more thing with regard to Egypt. I think Egypt is quite unique, and we'll probably get into this in the next session, in terms of the Ikhwan having two clear enemies. Only the Ikhwan, not the people in Tahrir. One being the army and its regime incorporated, and Israel. And they can play both in order to achieve power. Thank you.
Will you answer?
Whatever you want.
Whatever way. We are ready to collect another question or two, so yes, gentleman in the back.
Thank you for an interesting speech. I'm Sune Hawkboller from Copenhagen University. I'm wondering if perhaps when the Middle East is in transition, Middle East studies might be in transition too. And do you not think that when we're looking at these revolutions, we should be focusing on the actors rather than the actors that we expected? So my point is that all this talk of Islamists, is it really timely now? Should we not rather focus on the actual actors, so the leftists and perhaps the secular activists in question? And there's also a question of historiography, if you want here. Don't you think that perhaps we have paid rather too little attention to these trends, ideological trends, in the last 20 years? I'm also thinking about the labor unions and the people who have helped in organizing in Egypt in particular, but also in Tunisia. So my question is, the fact that what happened has baffled us so much, doesn't that pose questions as to the things that we have focused on in the Middle East? Thank you.
Thank you.
You mentioned before when discussing...
Can you speak louder?
You mentioned before when discussing 9/11 that you saw it as a political failure for Al-Qaeda. I mean, the operation itself, and when assessing the result a few years looking backward. And I wonder if that's really, I mean, I agree with you that during the 1990s there was a failure to mobilize the masses on the part of the jihadist movement, specifically Al-Qaeda, and maybe the attack against the United States was part of that failure, really an externalization of the struggle. But I wonder if that's really a correct assessment of the attacks. If we look at the fact that many of Al-Qaeda's operations following 9/11 were focused on Europe, either taking place in Europe or originating in Europe, and the fact that the Iraq War, the American invasion in 2003, was perceived as a victory, as maybe a continuation of the Afghan jihad in the sense of a new consciousness that was developed following the attacks. I mean, I think that it didn't bring any of the promised political change or mobilization in the Arab world. But if we look as in Europe as the sphere of operations, then maybe we can see a kind of a new consciousness or a new sense of achievement that the last time that we saw it maybe was
a sense of achievement by Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, by Al-Qaeda, and
in Europe.
Yes, and the fact that many young alienated Muslims found a sense of belonging, maybe a new consciousness of the Ummah that we saw last in Afghanistan in the end of the 1980s, maybe a sense of regeneration in the face of the struggle. And I would argue that maybe the struggle itself and not the end result is a victory. And the fact that there is kind of an ongoing engagement, particularly in Iraq in starting 2003, as and we can see today as a protracted conflict in Iraq, and the fact that it's kind of defensive measures taken both in Europe and the United States, maybe is kind of an achievement in of itself.
Thank you. Thank you.
Maybe I'll try to address those three. Let me start with question 2, Scandinavian question. I don't think that in my presentation I focused mainly on Islamists, on the contrary. But I don't think you were addressing this issue at my own presentation, but also the general field of studies. Haven't we missed the point and in focusing on Islamists and not on secularists, leftists and activists, and we have not paid attention to, or too little attention to, the labor unions and the like? No, I believe that, I mean, I can't speak for the whole field of studies, of course, but I believe that it was necessary to analyze what was taking place in the name of Islamism. I mean, Al-Qaeda studies had become a sort of a cottage industry in the U.S., definitely, and everyone who wanted some funding from the MOD or the CIA or what have you, and there was a lot of money available, wrote a book about the psyche of terrorists and what have you, and those things will probably not mark the history of academe in the years to come and will be forgotten. But the study of Islamists and the study of their literature, or their attempt to mobilize, was extremely important, if only because even if they fail, and I'll go back to that, they focused the attention of the world, and they developed a huge amount of resources, and they were also instrumental in showing that the balance of power in the world system had changed. And what they managed to do, something which was more important than their own agenda, actually, was to show that the U.S., whom many people think was as Hubert Védrine once said, was the hyperpower, was that by the end of the two superpowers era, there had been one superpower. It was not anymore. That the US was unable to deliver, was unable to control, that the 9/11 and the reactions to 9/11 was a clear test of the limitations of US power, militarily, politically, and so on and so forth, under George Bush and also under Obama. And so, even though the Islamists or the radical Islamists will probably not be able to collect the fruits of all that, nevertheless, they pointed at major changes in the world system. They were able to find out the fault lines and to exploit them, even if they did not manage to reap it for their own benefit. Now, this leads me to question 3. I'll get back to question 1 afterwards. That even though there was a political failure of Al-Qaeda per se, nevertheless, they were successful because of what happened in Iraq ultimately and what happened in Europe. Well, what happened in Iraq, I think, was the biggest failure for Sunni Islamists, because jihadi operations in Iraq killed many more Iraqis than they killed foreigners, so foreign soldiers or what have you, invaders if you'd rather. And the biggest amount of Iraqis they killed when the insurgency was at its peak were Shia Iraqis. And instead of leading to jihad as a movement that would unite the ranks of the Muslim world and make it supreme and make it reign over the world, Al-Qaeda led to the opposite of jihad, which is fitna, which is strife within the ranks of Muslims, and a strife that goes back to the very origins of Islamic civilization, i.e. the irreconcilable divide between Shias and Sunnis, and to the fact that after Al-Qaeda and American invasion, Iraq is now a country which is largely controlled by a Shia coalition, which is, for the time being, looking at Iran with loving eyes. And for Al-Qaeda, for a Sunni Salafist, very anti-Shia movement, it's a major failure. It's also a big failure for the US. But it's, both the actors that fought to control Iraq have failed. And the third actor, the Iranians, for the time being, who have the upper hand. I don't think it will last, but so even that cannot be put on Al-Qaeda's political credit, if you want. As far as Europe, you're right to an extent, because this identification with Islamist actions seen on TV fuels some sort of aspirations among some of the dissatisfied Muslim youth in Europe. But we don't have to exaggerate it, when we had, and I've been working for the last 6 months and doing field work in a banlieue, because this is a word that does not have to be translated into foreign languages. Once upon a time, French would circulates words such as champagne or parfum. Now it's banlieue. In one of the banlieues in the north of Paris, where the riot started in October-November 2005, Clichy-sous-Bois and Montfermeil. And what is very striking there is that, as opposed to what was written in the U.S. and in Israeli press largely, those were not Muslim riots. I mean, it was not Ben Laden and whatever. No, the movement was mainly social and economic and political, and was asking for more participation and inclusion into the system. To an extent, it used Islamic parlance in order to define identity. But it was not at all on Al-Qaeda's terms. And what is interesting is that precisely with the Arab democratic revolutions, this is something that I believe is going to change the software of quote-unquote Muslim revolts in Europe. Because instead of identifying with Al-Qaeda and its like, there is a new field for identification now, which is the language of democracy and of political participation. And if European authorities are able to use that significantly, I'm not very confident, I think it will bring a great opportunity, a great political opportunity. Question 1 about the Ikhwan and the fact that their ultimate goal is Islamic domination, implementation of Sharia, and so on and so forth. It is still in the mind of a number of people, and I believe that our Turkish colleagues here can discuss that more in depth than I could. But then, in terms of ideology, you still have a number of people in the AKP, in the ruling AKP in Turkey, who believe that the implementation of Sharia is the ultimate goal and that the stoning of adulterous women is what you have to do. But by the same token, I have some friends who are female AKP members of parliament who wear short skirts, wouldn't think of wearing a hijab, and have an appreciation of wine, which doesn't have much to do with the tenets of the radicals in the party. And what I believe is that, as I said in the introduction to my presentation, Islamist movements today are Sunni Islamists, deeply and profoundly divided. And that the Muslim brothers, the Ikhwan in Egypt, are striving to unite their ranks for the time being. And I haven't been to Egypt yet. I'm going to go there next month, but since the revolution. But from the feedback I have from the students I have there, the friends and the like, I mean, it looks like the brothers, for the time being, are at loss. You know, that some of them are very strong on this issue that we want Islamic revolution, we're going to destroy Israel, we're going to get rid of the military, and so on and so forth. There is no doubt that it's on their mind. But politics is also about implementation. Will they be able to mobilize a constituency which is sufficient in order to translate their views into political mobilization or not? Right? And this is the big question mark for today. My gut feeling, but I may be totally mistaken, and we decided with Amnon that we are not predicting history, we're trying to understand what happens, is that as opposed to the Shia movements, whether they be Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Iranians, of course, you do not have a structured and hierarchical movement that is able to pass on orders, marching orders, unify the ranks, which was the great strength of Khomeini and the great strength of Hezbollah also. I mean, to a large extent, the Iranian clergy under Khomeini and Hezbollah under Hassan Nasrallah are Leninist systems that are able, to have this unity of mobilization. And it's not the case with the brothers. Poor Mohammed Badir, former professor of gym in physical education, I believe does not really have the capacity to lead. I've known for 30 years the ones who are now, Issam al-Aryan, who's now the official spokesperson, was a man I wrote about in my PhD 30 years ago, and when he was a student, a medical student, and I still kept in touch with him, and I'm not sure they're able to mobilize the rank and file for the time being. We'll see. It will largely depend on, they're not the only players. It's a game which is very open. What is the military going to do? Is the military united, which is not sure anymore? And what are the so-called secularists or the Twitter generation going to do?
I would like to thank very much our speaker, who actually didn't predict the final future or the faraway future, but definitely gave us a few hints as to possible scenarios in the forthcoming months ahead of us. I would like to thank him very much for a thoughtful, very thoughtful analysis of the recent developments and the present, and we're looking forward to discuss with him in the future how it will actually evolve. Thank you very much, Professor Kepel.